So am I really supposed to believe that this piece of paper will come to life? Well, yes, but not exactly. It's called Very briefly defined, magical realism combines realism and the fantastic, so that the marvelous seems to grow organically within the ordinary, blurring the distinction between them. This genre stemmed from a style in German painting but was popularized in literature through Latin American fiction. Magical realism is not only a unique form of storytelling, but also a popular mode of expression, especially in post-colonial cultures. It has allowed marginal voices and traditions to emerge in the form of literary masterpieces. A lot of this video will be referencing a book by Wendy B. Ferris, a professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Texas at Arlington, titled Ordinary Enchantments, Magical Realism, and the Remystification of Narrative. The book investigates magical realism in the context of contemporary international fiction and poses theories to explain its significance. But I was only able to get the introduction of the book because I'm not going to pay for it, but it's okay, we're not going to be able to cover that much anyway. The Chosen and the Beautiful by Nhi Vo rewrites The Great Gatsby from Jordan Baker's perspective as a queer and Vietnamese adoptee as she navigates through the journey of finding her identity, which is inexorably tied to the magical realism, also reflecting the author's relationship with her identity. This begs the question: is magical realism inherently tied to its cultural context, and how does it apply to The Chosen and the Beautiful? Magical realism derives from post-colonial literature. It is a cultural hybrid with the primary goal of destabilizing the dominant narrative of realism, that is, the Western literary framing. Many other important characteristics of magical realism, such as its relation to gender and feminism, are also defining elements of magical realism. As this genre expands into the reach of Western literature, even if a particular story itself doesn't directly correlate with its historical context and is only used as a means of subtle fantasy, it is impossible to erase the prominent history of the genre due to its emergence from colonialism. The historical ignorance is even more blatant in Western literature that utilizes magical realism because it is the form of literature that the genre is created to rebel against. In addition, in the rare scenario where an author from a marginalized culture incorporates magical realism into their novel but intentionally excludes their identity from the writing, knowing the context of that author's identity automatically links the culture to the novel's magical realistic aspects because of the roots of the genre, even if that relation is subtle or inferred. Ferris identifies 5 major aspects of magical realism: the irreducible element, the presence of the phenomenal world, unsettling doubts that readers may have, the merging of different realms, and finally, the disturbance of ideas about time, space, and identity. To best illustrate the importance of cultural context, we will be focusing on the irreducible element and merging realities. The irreducible element is what allows us to accept the fantastical within a novel's reality, the given and accepted but not explained. It's what grounds the reader to the world that the author creates, grounding them to the magical rules that seem to have always existed, and makes it unsurprising when something new occurs, as the spontaneity and unknown parts of magic are a part of the accepted magical realism. More importantly, normalizing magical phenomena is often accounted for by integrating narrative traditions, whether that be well-known mythical, religious, or folklore elements, or traditions introduced within the novel that ties magic with culture. According to Amaral Chandy, while the implied author is educated according to our conventional norms of reason and logic, and can therefore recognize the supernatural as contrary to the laws of nature, he tries to accept the worldview of a culture in order to describe it. And that's why we can actually believe that demoniac is really demon's blood, and not just some drug. Before talking about Jordan Baker's character, I must briefly mention the significance of the implied author and the real author. This concept is especially important in this reframing of The Great Gatsby, since the original novel has a secondary character as the narrator, adding an additional layer to the layers of authors, and commenting on Fitzgerald's own role as the writer. Similar applies to The Chosen and the Beautiful, where Jordan's identity is even more prominent, implying the significance of identity to the safely assumed Asian American female author. Now, the next important element that Ferris writes about magical realism beautifully ties into Jordan's identity crisis in the novel. One way to think about merging realms is the intersection between reality and magic, but it can also be between different types of magic. The Vietnamese paper-cutting magic portrayed in the novel is clearly distinct from the demonic magic that surrounds the wealthy white people. As Jordan grew up in a wealthy and white environment, her surroundings and familiarities are the demonic versions of magic. The demoniac she drinks stems from a social purpose that creeps into her addiction and reliance on it, changing her to conform to this social realm. The imp that follows her at the end of the novel represents the environment surrounding her, something that is being done to her, rather than by her choice. Whereas paper cutting is a skill that Jordan naturally inherits, even when isolated from Vietnamese culture. As the novel progresses and Jordan learns more about her background and people from her missing culture, gaps in her identity are filled in the form of these magical elements, such as learning a name for paper cutting and watching others hone the power she always thought was unique to her. Jordan's relationship with magic is not only parallel with her identity, but is a part of her identity. The magical realist vision thus exists at the intersection of two worlds, at an imaginary point inside a double-sided mirror that reflects in both directions. We serve as the intersection between reality and magic. Jordan serves as the intersection between the two different types of magic in her world, as her identity is torn between the two. Niveau relies on the relationship between identity and magical realism into the world of The Great Gatsby in order to successfully assert the cultural significance of Jordan's background in The Chosen and the Beautiful. This novel serves as a great example of the broader expanse of magical realism's unbreakable tie to culture and history.